From the outside, Rome and the Ottoman Empire look like two distant giants standing on opposite sides of history. One rose from the disciplined legions of the ancient Mediterranean world. The other emerged from the relentless frontier warriors of Anatolia. Different centuries, different cultures, different symbols of power. And yet, when you look closer, much closer, something unsettling begins to appear. These were not just empires that conquered land. They were systems that learned how to manufacture power itself. Rome mastered the art of turning order into dominance. The Ottomans mastered the art of turning flexibility into survival. One built roads that stitched continents together. The other built an administrative machine that could absorb entire civilizations without collapsing under their weight. For centuries, both empires did something very few political systems in human history have managed to do. They did not merely expand, they endured. But endurance in history always carries a hidden cost, because behind the glory of marching legions and the elegance of imperial courts lies a deeper question, one that most historical comparisons quietly avoid. Which empire truly understood power, not just how to win battles, but how to control time, loyalty, and human behavior across generations? This is where the story stops being simple history. Rome was built on discipline so rigid it could conquer the known world. The Ottomans were built on adaptability so fluid they could outlive rivals who once seemed unstoppable. Two different philosophies of empire, two different answers to the same ancient problem. How do you build a system strong enough to survive the very success it creates? Because history shows us something uncomfortable. Most empires do not fall when they are weak. They fall when the system that once made them unstoppable begins slowly and almost invisibly to turn against them. In this video, we are not just comparing Rome and the Ottoman Empire. We are dissecting two of the most sophisticated power machines ever constructed by human hands, to understand not only how they rose, but what their stories quietly reveal about the true anatomy of empire itself. If one were to describe the general character of the Romans in a single phrase, it would not be luxury nor even conquest. It would be disciplined pragmatism. Roman society, from its early republican roots to its later imperial form, developed a cultural temperament that consistently prioritized order, duty, and practical results over abstract idealism. This was not accidental. Rome grew in a harsh, competitive environment where survival depended less on brilliance and more on reliability. Over generations, this pressure produced a people who valued structure, hierarchy, and long-term stability above impulsive glory. One of the most defining Roman traits was their deep respect for disciplina, the cultural obsession with discipline and controlled behavior. Roman citizens, especially in the Republic, were socialized from an early age to value self-restraint, obedience to law, and loyalty to the collective. The Roman legion reflected this mentality perfectly. Individual heroics were far less important than coordinated unit performance. Soldiers were trained to hold formation under extreme stress, to follow orders without hesitation, and to prioritize system cohesion over personal survival. This mindset extended beyond the battlefield into civilian governance. Roman administration functioned on the assumption that stable systems outlast charismatic individuals. Closely tied to discipline was Roman pragmatism. Unlike some ancient civilizations that pursued philosophical purity or ideological consistency, the Romans were remarkably flexible when practical advantage was at stake. They borrowed heavily from conquered cultures, Greek art, Hellenistic science, foreign military techniques, and integrated these elements into their own expanding system without excessive cultural insecurity. What mattered most was not originality, but utility. If something worked, Rome absorbed it. This pragmatic absorption became one of the empire's most powerful expansion tools. Another central feature of the Roman character was their strong legal consciousness. Romans developed an unusually deep respect for law as a stabilizing force. Even during periods of imperial autocracy, the symbolic authority of legal tradition remained culturally significant. Contracts, citizenship status, and administrative procedure were taken seriously because they created predictability in a vast and diverse empire. This legal mindset helped Rome manage complexity across enormous geographic distances, but it also gradually increased bureaucratic rigidity as the system matured. However, Roman strengths were accompanied by characteristic vulnerabilities. Their intense focus on order and hierarchy sometimes produced political inflexibility. Elite competition within the Republic repeatedly destabilized the system. Military loyalty, once firmly tied to the state, began shifting toward individual generals during the late Republic, creating long-term structural risk. Over time, the same disciplined machine that had powered Rome's expansion became increasingly heavy, complex, and difficult to reform quickly. Yet, despite these weaknesses, the Roman temperament proved extraordinarily durable. Their combination of discipline, pragmatism, legal structure, and institutional thinking allowed Rome to achieve something very few ancient powers managed: sustained dominance across centuries rather than decades. The Romans were not always the most innovative thinkers of the ancient world, nor always the most culturally refined, but they were, perhaps more than any of their contemporaries, masters of building systems that could endure beyond the lifetime of any single generation. And in the long history of empire, endurance is often the most revealing measure of all. Rome did not begin as an empire destined to dominate the Mediterranean world. It began as a small, vulnerable city-state on the banks of the Tiber River, surrounded by rival tribes and constantly exposed to external pressure. In its earliest centuries, survival was never guaranteed. Rome was forced to learn quickly, adapt repeatedly, and institutionalize discipline in ways that few early societies managed with such consistency. This harsh, competitive environment shaped the Roman mindset long before the Republic evolved into imperial rule. What emerged from these early struggles was not merely a military culture, but a deeply structured political organism that prioritized order, continuity, and systemic resilience. One of Rome's most defining characteristics was its unusual ability to transform short-term military success into long-term administrative control. Many ancient powers conquered territory, but far fewer successfully integrated those territories into a durable governing framework. Rome excelled at this transition. Through an expanding network of roads, standardized legal codes, and carefully managed provincial administration, the Romans created what might be described as one of history's first truly scalable state systems. Conquered regions were not simply looted and abandoned. They were gradually absorbed into a broader imperial structure that extended Roman influence far beyond the Italian peninsula. At the heart of this system stood the Roman military, particularly the legion. The Roman legion was not just a fighting force. It was a disciplined institutional machine built on standardization, rigorous training, and clear hierarchical command. Roman soldiers constructed roads, built fortifications, and enforced imperial presence wherever they were deployed. This dual military administrative function allowed Rome to project power with remarkable efficiency across vast distances. Yet Rome's strength was never purely military. Equally important was its legal and political architecture. Roman law developed into one of the most sophisticated legal traditions of the ancient world, emphasizing codification, precedent, and procedural governance. Even as Rome transitioned from republic to empire, many of these institutional habits remained embedded in the system. However, the very strengths that made Rome extraordinarily effective also carried long-term structural consequences. Systems built on high levels of standardization and institutional rigidity often achieve impressive early stability, but may struggle to adapt quickly when external conditions shift. As the empire expanded and complexity increased, maintaining cohesion across such a vast and diverse territory required ever greater administrative effort and political coordination. Over time, internal pressures, economic strain, military overextension, elite competition, and shifting loyalty within the army began to test the resilience of the Roman model. Still, Rome's endurance remains historically remarkable. The Western Roman Empire would dominate Mediterranean geopolitics for centuries, while the Eastern continuation, later known as Byzantium, preserved Roman institutional DNA for nearly 1,000 years more. Few political systems in human history have demonstrated such longevity at such scale. This is why Rome remains one of the most important case studies in the anatomy of empire. It represents the power of discipline, law, and institutional continuity when applied with exceptional consistency across generations. And yet, as history repeatedly reminds us, the same systems that create long-lasting strength can also, under the right pressures, become sources of hidden fragility. Understanding Rome, therefore, is not simply about admiring its rise. It is about examining how one of humanity's most formidable imperial machines was built, and how the very mechanisms that sustained it for centuries would eventually face the limits imposed by time, complexity, and the evolving realities of power itself. The Ottoman Empire did not rise through rigid uniformity alone. From its earliest frontier origins, the Ottoman state developed a political and cultural temperament built less on inflexible discipline and more on controlled adaptability. Emerging in the volatile borderlands of late medieval Anatolia, the early Ottomans operated in an environment where survival depended on reading shifting power balances quickly and incorporating diverse populations without immediate systemic fracture. This frontier DNA left a permanent imprint on the Ottoman governing style and collective character. One of the most defining Ottoman traits was strategic flexibility. Unlike Rome's heavy reliance on standardized institutional expansion, the Ottomans often preferred layered integration. Newly conquered regions were not always forced into immediate cultural uniformity. Instead, the empire frequently allowed local administrative, religious, and social structures to continue functioning under Ottoman sovereignty, provided that loyalty and tax obligations were maintained. This approach reduced resistance in newly absorbed territories and allowed the empire to expand across culturally diverse regions with relatively lower initial administrative friction. Closely connected to this flexibility was the Ottoman mastery of centralized authority combined with decentralized management. At the symbolic and political center stood the Sultan, whose legitimacy blended military leadership, dynastic continuity, and religious authority. Yet beneath this highly centralized apex existed a surprisingly sophisticated administrative ecosystem. The Devashirme system recruited and trained elite administrators and Janissary soldiers directly loyal to the central state rather than to local aristocracies. The millet system allowed religious communities to govern many of their own internal affairs. Provincial Taimar arrangements distributed land revenues in ways that supported cavalry forces while maintaining imperial oversight. Together, these mechanisms created a dynamic balance between control and accommodation. Another core Ottoman characteristic was institutional pragmatism. Much like the Romans in their own way, the Ottomans showed little hesitation in adopting useful technologies, military techniques, or administrative practices from neighboring powers. The early and effective use of large-scale gunpowder artillery, particularly in the conquest of Constantinople in 1453, demonstrated the empire's willingness to integrate emerging military innovations rapidly when they offered strategic advantage. This practical mindset extended into governance as well, where the Ottomans continuously adjusted tax structures, provincial administration, and military organization in response to changing geopolitical realities. However, the Ottoman system also contained long-term structural tensions. The very flexibility that enabled rapid expansion could, over centuries, produce administrative complexity that became increasingly difficult to reform. The Janissary Corps, originally one of the empire's most effective, centralized military tools, gradually developed entrenched interests that resisted modernization. Provincial autonomy sometimes expanded beyond what the central government could easily recalibrate. As external pressures from European industrial and military transformation intensified in the 18th and 19th centuries, the Ottoman system faced mounting strain between its adaptive traditions and the accelerating pace of global change. Yet despite these challenges, the Ottoman Empire achieved one of the most remarkable feats in imperial history: sustained rule across 3 continents for over 6 centuries. This longevity was not the product of brute force alone. It emerged from a governing philosophy that blended central authority with calculated flexibility, military strength with administrative accommodation, and ideological legitimacy with pragmatic adjustment. In contrast to Rome's heavy institutional rigidity, the Ottoman imperial character can best be understood as a carefully managed balance between control and adaptation, a living political organism that, for many centuries, proved exceptionally capable of surviving in a complex and constantly shifting world. In the final analysis, Rome and the Ottoman Empire were not simply 2 powerful states separated by time. They were 2 different answers to the same enduring human problem: how to build power that lasts. Rome trusted in discipline, law, and institutional permanence. It constructed one of the most formidable administrative machines the ancient world had ever seen, a system designed to impose order across vast and diverse territories. The Ottomans, emerging in a later and more fluid geopolitical environment, leaned more heavily on controlled adaptability. They built an empire capable of absorbing difference, managing complexity, and recalibrating authority when conditions shifted. For centuries, both approaches worked with remarkable effectiveness. Rome dominated the Mediterranean world and left institutional legacies that still echo in modern legal and political systems. The Ottoman Empire ruled across 3 continents and maintained imperial cohesion far longer than many of its contemporaries. Measured purely by longevity and influence, both stand among the most successful imperial experiments in human history. And yet, beneath their achievements lies a shared historical pattern that no empire has fully escaped. The very systems that create long-term strength often generate new forms of rigidity over time. Discipline can harden into inflexibility. Flexibility can drift into administrative overextension. Military superiority can breed strategic complacency. In both Rome and the Ottoman Empire, success gradually produced structural pressures that became increasingly difficult to manage as the centuries passed. This is the deeper lesson their comparison reveals. Empires rarely collapse simply because they become weak. More often, they struggle when the mechanisms that once guaranteed their stability become less responsive to a changing world. The Roman system grew heavy under the weight of its own scale. The Ottoman system faced mounting strain as the pace of global transformation accelerated beyond what its traditional balancing mechanisms could easily absorb. What remains, however, is not just a story of decline, but a powerful insight into the anatomy of power itself. Both Rome and the Ottoman Empire demonstrate that enduring dominance requires more than military strength or territorial expansion. It requires a delicate and constantly evolving balance between order and adaptability, between institutional stability and systemic flexibility, and perhaps that is the quiet message history continues to offer. No empire, no matter how disciplined or how adaptive, ever truly escapes the long shadow of time.